Hello guys, so this is part 2 of the React.js login application, and in this episode we're gonna finish the front end user interface. So we can go ahead and remove this input field here because we're not gonna use it from the app.js component, we're gonna use it from the login form component. So to remove that, we're also gonna change the content type here in the componented mount method as well as in the doLogout method. There's a typo here, it's supposed to be a capital T. So go ahead and change that to content type with capital T. Right, so in the last or in the previous episode we created a couple of API calls here in the component in mount method to check if the user is logged in or not when first visiting the site. And we also created an API call to the logout API endpoint, which will be used for logging out. We will create these API endpoints in the next episode when we're building the backend. We also created input field, login form, and submit button components. We didn't write any code in these components, so we're gonna go ahead and do that now. So go ahead and open up the submit button component to begin with. I'm gonna change the syntax here to Babel as well. So in this component, we're gonna add a simple normal HTML5 button, which we can reuse by passing some props to the button properties. So we can start by defining a class name here. We can call this button. We're gonna add it in the CSS later. We're also gonna add a disabled, so we can set whether or not it should be disabled by passing in props to it from the parent. And on click, we're gonna use a callback to a prop, which we can also pass from the parent. This way we can define multiple different functions for the onClick property. We're also gonna add this.props.text so we can pass in different texts to the button depending on what we want. So now let's just check if that button works. So let's open up app.js and we can add it down here. We can copy this button here, add it here, and yeah, we got a button and the text is log out for it. All right, just to check that the component is actually working. All right, so that's it for the submit button. Now let's go ahead and also create an input field, which will be one component that can be used for username and password. So let's create a normal HTML input. You can give this a class name of input. Type, we're gonna pass that as props. So this can be, for example, email, text, or password. Placeholder is gonna be passed from the parent by a prop as well, if you want a placeholder. And value, let's pass it from the parent as well. And on change, we're gonna use a callback to a parent function as well, or to a prop function passed as a prop. So let's say this is .props, and that function can be called onChange. And in the onChange arguments, we're gonna pass the value of the input. All right, so we're accessing the value by using e.target.value from the input. All right, and that's it for the input. Let's just go ahead and open up, or we can do that later to check if it works. And then we need to create the actual login form as well. So let's open up loginform.js, gonna change the syntax here to Babel. And here we're gonna use the input field, so go ahead and import it. We're also gonna need a submit button. And we're also gonna need a user store to set some data whether or not we are logging in successfully. So stores and user store. All right. So let's just type login form there for now, so we can see that it's actually the login form that's being rendered to the DOM right now. I'm gonna go ahead and define a constructor, pass in props, call super props on the constructor, or in the constructor, sorry. We're also gonna need some state here. So this.state, we're gonna use the username, which is a string. We're gonna need password, which is a string as well. We're also gonna add a state called button disable, set it to false. So the username will be used for holding the username value from the input. Password is same, but holding the password value, of course. And button disable will be used for when a user clicks log in and the API starts checking if the user actually exists. We're gonna disable the button and then re-enable it if it's the wrong password or something like that. Just so we don't get any double requests to the API. Then we're gonna define a method here called setInputValue. I'm gonna let's pass in a property and val for value. And the value is gonna be a string, which we're gonna trim because we don't want any spaces. Let's also say if value.length is bigger than 12. Let's just return false. So the input value is gonna be either the username or the password. So we know it will be a string, so we can trim it to get rid of spaces. And we're also setting a maximum length here of both username and password to 12. All right. And then go ahead and set the state. And the state is then gonna be the property we're gonna pass, which will either be username or password. But by doing this way, we can actually reuse the same method, which make it easy to work with. And we're gonna set the property to the value. All right, we're gonna use this method in a couple of minutes. We're also gonna define a method called resetForm, which is simply used for resetting the form if something is incorrect. So we can reset the username, password, and button disable to false. So for example, if the user types the wrong password or the wrong username, the form will be reset so the user can retype. All right. Then we're gonna create a new API call to the yet not existing API. We can call this method doLogin. And this is gonna be called later when we click the submit button to log in. And let's check here, if not a username exists, return. Same thing if not a password exists, let's return. Let's also set the state of button disabled to not false to true, so the user can't double click the submit button. And then let's add another try catch statement here. Oops. So we're gonna try to access an API point here. So await fetch. We can call this API point login later. It's gonna be method post headers is gonna be the same as we've done previously, application JSON for accept and also for content type. All right. We're also gonna pass in a body here, which we're gonna need to stringify with the JSON. And what we're gonna pass is the username, which will be held in the state, this.state.username, as well as the password, so this.state.password. All right, so this is gonna send the username and password to the API that we will create in the next episode, and then check against the database if this username and password exists, and then create a session and log in the user. We also need to access the result, so create a variable, call it result, and we're gonna say await result.json to get the result data as a JSON format. And if result and result.success, we're gonna say user store. Let's see that we have imported the user store. Yeah, we have. Good. So if the user is successfully logged in, we're gonna set the isLoggedIn property to true, just as we did in the component in mount method in app.js when a component is first loading. But this is then, of course, when the user submits the login form. So it's the same kind of logic, really. And user store.username, we're gonna set that as well to result.username, which is a property we're gonna pass back with the JSON response from the API. Else if result and result.success equals with false, we're gonna use the reset form, and we're also gonna alert the error, so we can create a property called message, and we can return an error from the API later. All right. And if there's some problem getting to the API, connecting to the API, let's just console log the error so we can debug, and also call reset form, so the form is reset. All right, so let's go ahead now and create the actual UI for the login form when we got the API calls ready here. So we're gonna use the input field as well as the submit button here. So let's just type here login as a little header, and then create the input field, which we just created, and we get some props now we can pass to it. So we can start by passing text as type, because this will be for the username. So the placeholder as well is gonna be username. And we're also gonna set the value here. And now we're passing the value as a prop. As you remember, we set this as a prop inside the input field component. So we can say this.state.username, use a ternary operator here. So if it's set, let's use this.state.username, else let's just return an empty value. All right. And we also create an onChange prop that we can access here. So go ahead and create an arrow function, and let's see here, input field, the onChange is this prop's onChange, and it takes an argument of the value of the input field. So we're gonna pass the value in here to access it. And then we're gonna use the set input value we created right here to actually set the value of the username and password, right? So the username in this case. And to do that, we're gonna have to pass first the property. So the property for that state is username. The value is val, right? So let's just check that everything's alright. Alright, we got an error here. Line 89. Oops, it's not supposed to be a comma there. And there we go, we got the actual input field. See if we type some stuff in it. It works, and if it's more than 12 characters, it stops, which is exactly what we want. So this is just really a simple kind of front-end validation here to make sure the user is not typing 5,000 letters. But we're gonna do some simple validation on the back end as well later. Alright, so that's it for the username. Now we're gonna reuse this component, but this time it's gonna be for the password. So the type is gonna be a password. Placeholder is gonna be password. And the state used to set the value for this is gonna be password. And when we set in the input value, we're gonna access the password state, right? So as you can see, we had a password here with hidden characters as well. Great. Now we're also gonna need this submit button we just created. So we can pass a couple of props here, disabled on click, and the text for the button. So let's go ahead and create it. And the text for this can be login, disabled, which is a prop that's accessed inside the submit button, is gonna be the state we set in this component. So this is the state.button disabled. And the onClick function is gonna call the method doLogin that we created up here, which is an API call to the API endpoint login, right? Where we are passing the username and password of the user. All right. So that's it for the form. Now we're gonna add some simple styling. Now this tutorial isn't really about CSS, so I've already written the CSS for this. I'm gonna leave a comment in the video, and you can just copy this CSS because it's really not a lot of CSS. Go ahead and open up app.css, remove everything, paste the CSS from the comment. I'm gonna make it a marked comment as well so you can see it. All right, so let's open up. And yeah, everything seems to be looking pretty good. Now you can of course style all of this how much you want. I've just written really simple layout styles for this. All right, so it's just 6 or 7 classes or something like that. All right, so that's it for the styling. Now go ahead and open up the app in the browser, click inspect, click network. We're just gonna see here that the API endpoint is actually called. So let's just type something. And as you can see, it's calling the login. We're sending a couple of headers. Now we're getting 404 not found here, of course, because we haven't created the API yet. And you can see in the request payload, this is what we are sending from the API call right here. So the stringified username and password. So we seem to be getting the data. Yeah. Good. And let's also just load the browser, check here. So the is logged in endpoint is called, and it's called as well. Good. So we're getting a bunch of errors here, of course, since we haven't created the API, but that's all right, because they will disappear once we create the API. So that's it for the login form. Can go ahead and close this now. And if there's anything we need to change later, we just gonna come back and change it. And a couple of thoughts here on the app.js file. What you can do if you want to is you can check out how the React router works and use a router to render the correct view instead of using render logic like I'm using here. All right. I'm not gonna use the router in this tutorial because this tutorial is mainly focused on creating a login and logout system and not actually using the router. But you can implement a router easily in this if you just check out how it works. And as well, if you're planning to use like messages and stuff from your users, if you continue to develop the application, do not simply trust the user store that the user is logged in. All right, then we can get any data or any messages or something like that, because this could be set by someone from the front end. So what you want to do is every time you call an API endpoint, is you use some kind of validation to check if the user actually is logged in. All right. But for this tutorial, this is enough. Now we're just gonna go ahead and actually build the application as well, because we will be serving this front-end application from a Node.js app in the next tutorial, in the next episode. So go ahead and type npm run build. And now this is gonna create a build folder in the app where you created the project, the React project. And we're simply just gonna copy and paste this build folder to the API folder in the next tutorial. But go ahead and build it like I did, so you get it ready for the next episode. All right, that's it for the UI. In the next tutorial, in the next episode, we're gonna create the API. Bye bye.